The radar operator at the Chain Home station in Dover rubbed his tired eyes, the green glow of the cathode ray tube painting his face in ghostly hues. Outside, the English Channel stretched gray and restless under the February dawn of 1944. He'd been staring at the same empty screen for 6 hours, his mind numbed by the monotonous hum of the equipment. The Luftwaffe hadn't mounted a serious raid in weeks. The big week of strategic bombing was over, or so everyone thought. The war, it seemed to men like him, had settled into a grim, predictable rhythm. He took a sip of lukewarm tea, the bitter taste doing little to cut through his fatigue. His thoughts drifted to the briefing from the night before, where a smug intelligence officer from the Air Ministry had assured them that German fighter production was in its death throes, that the Reich was scraping the bottom of its technological and industrial barrel. "They're throwing together makeshift aircraft with slave labor," the officer had declared, pointing to grainy reconnaissance photos of what he claimed were poorly constructed Focke-Wulfs. "Their quality is plummeting. They can't replace their losses. The skies are nearly ours." The operator almost believed it. Almost. But something in the man's voice had been a little too confident, a little too rehearsed. It was the kind of certainty that made veterans nervous. He'd seen overconfidence before, in 1940, and he knew how quickly it could curdle into panic. Suddenly, a faint, trembling blip appeared at the extreme edge of his screen, so far out it was almost dismissed as an atmospheric ghost. He leaned forward, his chair creaking in the silent room. The blip didn't fade. It grew. Then another appeared beside it, and another. In less than 30 seconds, the far left of his screen was blossoming with a swarm of contacts the likes of which he hadn't seen since the Blitz. But this was different. The speed, it was all wrong. The plots advanced with a terrifying, impossible velocity. His heart hammered against his ribs. He grabbed the telephone, his hand trembling slightly. "Filter room, this is Dover CH. I have multiple hostiles, bearing 085, range 150 miles. Speed." He paused, double-checking the calculations on his plotting table. The numbers made no sense. "Speed estimate 450 miles per hour. Repeat, 450. A skeptical voice crackled back. "Check your calibration, Dover. That's beyond their operational ceiling for a formation that size. You're probably seeing a weather front. I'm telling you it's a raid, a massive one. The speed is—" "Calm down, operator. It's likely a fighter sweep. They'll turn back before they reach the coast. They always do." But they didn't turn back. The swarm on his screen only grew denser, its course unerringly straight for the English coast. The impossible speed remained constant. He felt a cold dread seep into his gut. This wasn't the lumbering, predictable Luftwaffe they had been fighting for the past year. This was something new, something they had not been told to expect. The intelligence was wrong. Horribly, catastrophically wrong. And as he watched the glowing swarm devour the miles between France and England, he realized with chilling clarity that the comfortable narrative of a dying Luftwaffe was about to be shattered. This conviction, this gnawing fear in the gut of a lowly radar operator, was the first tiny crack in the wall of Allied certainty. But the foundations of that certainty had been laid over years of success and carefully cultivated assumptions. The roots of the coming shock stretched back to the war's earlier, darker days, to a time when Allied intelligence had looked at Germany's war machine and seen what they wanted to see. The prevailing wisdom in the Allied High Command, particularly within the USAAF and the Air Ministry, was a tapestry woven from threads of truth, racial prejudice, and the comforting logic of industrial superiority. Germany, they reasoned, was a nation being strangled. The combined bomber offensive was systematically dismantling its industrial base. Cities like Schweinfurt, Regensburg, and Berlin had been pummeled in a series of brutal, costly raids throughout 1943 and early 1944. The official assessments, like the one delivered to General Karl Toohey, Spaatz, commander of U.S. Strategic Air Forces in Europe, were unequivocal. German fighter production had peaked and was now in irreversible decline. A key document, the Joint Intelligence Committee report of January 1944, stated with authority, "The German aircraft industry, reeling from our attacks on its airframe and ball-bearing plants, is incapable of sustaining current loss rates. We estimate monthly fighter production to be between 600 and 800 units. They cannot keep pace." This number was not just wrong, it was a fantasy. It was based on extrapolations from pre-raid production figures, a fundamental misunderstanding of German dispersal efforts, and a dismissal of reports from agents on the ground who spoke of new, hidden factories springing up in forests and mountains. The Allies were fighting the Luftwaffe of 1943, not the one being forged in the frantic, desperate crucible of 1944. The prejudice was equally powerful. There was a pervasive, unshakable belief in Western military circles in German methodological rigidity. They were brilliant engineers, yes, but they were also seen as ponderous, incapable of the rapid, flexible innovation that characterized American industry. A German aircraft design was considered a masterpiece of over-engineering, beautiful but slow to produce and difficult to modify. A memo from the office of General Ira Eker, commander of the 8th Air Force, captured this sentiment perfectly. The enemy is tactically and technically inflexible. He will continue to refine existing types rather than risk the disruption of introducing radically new designs in quantity. This belief blinded them to the reality of Germany's Jederstab, fighter staff, a crash program initiated by Albert Speer and Erhard Milch that had thrown out the rulebook. Under the ruthless efficiency of SS Obergruppenführer Karl Otto Sauer, German fighter production was undergoing a revolution that defied all Allied predictions. Then there was the technological arrogance. Allied pilots and commanders had grown accustomed to a certain technological edge. The Norden bombsight, the rugged durability of the B-17 Flying Fortress, the increasing range of their P-47 Thunderbolt and P-38 Lightning escorts, these were the pillars of their confidence. The introduction of the P-51 Mustang, with its game-changing range, had seemingly sealed the deal. The bomber would always get through, and now the fighters could protect it all the way. The Luftwaffe's response was expected to be more of the same. Determined, but ultimately futile, attacks by the same FW-190s and Bf-109s they had been fighting for years. Aircraft that were now considered qualitatively inferior to the latest Allied models. What no one in the upper echelons of the Allied command fully grasped was that they were basing their entire strategy on a phantom. The intelligence was a mosaic with half the tiles missing, and the ones they had were from a different picture altogether. They saw a cornered, bleeding beast. They did not see the predator that was gathering itself for one last, terrifying spring. While Allied intelligence analysts confidently charted the Luftwaffe's demise on their wall maps, a storm was gathering in the hidden forests and dispersed factories of the Third Reich. A storm born of desperation and engineering genius that would soon break over the skies of Europe with a violence nobody thought possible. The truth, hidden from Allied view by a masterful campaign of deception and dispersal, was staggering. Far from collapsing, German fighter production was not merely recovering, it was exploding. From a low of around 700 fighters in July 1943, the numbers had climbed precipitously. By November, it was over 1,000. By January 1944, the month of the confident Allied intelligence assessment, the real figure was closer to 1,500. And in February, the very month the radar operator in Dover saw his impossible blips, the factories of the Reich would produce an astonishing 22-0 single-engine fighters. This was not the output of a dying industry. It was the output of a war machine operating at a frenzied, terrifying peak. This miracle of production was orchestrated by the Jederstab, which had centralized control and ruthlessly prioritized fighter construction. They broke down production into tiny components built in hundreds of small, hidden workshops, often little more than cleared patches in forests or disguised village barns, then assembled in massive, camouflaged bunkers and underground facilities. The vast, sprawling factory at Wiener Neustadt was replicated in miniature across Germany, making it virtually immune to the kind of knockout blow the Allies sought. But the surprise was not just in the numbers. It was in the quality. The Allies were fixated on the FW-190 and Bf-109, but two new predators were entering the fray in numbers they could not conceive. The first was the Focke-Wulf FW-190D, the Long Nose, or Dora. This was not a minor refinement. It was a radical redesign, powered by a liquid-cooled Junkers Jumo 213 engine that transformed the stout, radial-engined fighter into a high-altitude monster. Its performance above 30,000 feet eclipsed almost everything the Allies could put in the air. Test pilots reported it was 30 to 50 mph faster than the standard FW-190A at critical altitudes, with a breathtaking rate of climb. Yet the Dora was merely the opening act. The true shock was taking shape in the secret design bureaus and heavily guarded test fields. While Allied agents looked for new aircraft designs, they missed the real revolution: the systematic, mass fielding of radical new weapons and equipment designed to shatter the bomber boxes. One such weapon was the Werfer Granate 21, a monstrous 21 cm rocket fired from a tube under the wing of a fighter. It was not aimed with precision. It was an area effect weapon. A single launch into the heart of a tight B-17 formation could blow bombers out of the sky through concussion alone, breaking the perfect defensive boxes that had been the bane of German pilots. Even more terrifying were the new armored assault tactics being drilled into a new generation of pilots. The idea was simple, brutal, and born of desperation. Standard attack runs from the rear or the beam were too costly. Instead, specially armored FW-190s, loaded with heavy 30 cannon, would form into Sturmgruppen, assault groups. They would fly in tight, stacked formations, approach the bombers from the front in a head-on pass, the most difficult shot for the B-17's gunners, and open fire at point-blank range, sometimes as close as 100 yards. They were instructed to not break away until they were about to collide, relying on their armor to absorb the 50 caliber rounds from the terrified bomber crews. It was aerial jousting, a tactic of sheer, terrifying nerve. The man spearheading this tactical revolution was a legendary ace, Oberstleutnant Hans-Georg von Kornatzky, a fervent believer in the ramming if necessary ethos. He handpicked the most aggressive pilots, the ones with fire in their bellies, and trained them relentlessly at the secret base at Stargard. They practiced the head-on approach over and over, learning to hold their fire until the bomber filled their windscreen, to ignore the tracers streaming past their cockpits, to embrace the collision course as the only path to victory. They were being forged into a weapon of shock and awe, designed not just to shoot down bombers, but to break the will of the men who flew in them. Meanwhile, in the electronic labs, another surprise was being prepared. The Germans had become masters of the radar game. They knew the Allies relied on their H-2S radar for navigation and bombing through cloud. They developed the Naxos Z detector, a simple device that could home in on the H-2S transmissions from a B-17 or Lancaster from over 60 miles away. For the first time, German fighters could be vectored directly to a bomber stream through the thickest overcast, appearing out of the clouds without warning. The Allied belief in the protection offered by bad weather was about to be violently dispelled. All these pieces, the surge in production, the new high-performance aircraft, the heavy-caliber rockets, the suicidal Sturmgruppen tactics, and the electronic detection, were being assembled in strictest secrecy. The German High Command knew they had one last chance to stop the American daylight offensive before it crippled the fuel supplies that kept the Wehrmacht and what was left of the Luftwaffe alive. They were preparing a counterstroke of such concentrated violence that they hoped it would convince the Americans that the cost of daylight bombing was simply too high to bear. The plan had a name, Operation Donnerkeil Thunderbolt, but the first rumbles of the coming storm were not in the plans, but in the confused and dismissed reports from the front lines of the air war. The signs began to appear in late January and early February of 1944, flickers of the coming inferno that were systematically explained away by an intelligence apparatus unwilling to question its own core assumptions. They were the whispers before the scream. On January 29, a returning B-17 pilot from the 91st Bomb Group, his fortress riddled with holes, reported an encounter that was logged as pilot exaggeration. He swore that a flight of FW-190s had attacked his formation from above, outclimbing the P-47 escorts with ease. They weren't the same planes, he insisted to his intelligence officer. Longer noses, much faster in the climb. Our escorts couldn't touch them. The report was filed with a note suggesting the pilot was likely disoriented by combat stress and had misidentified a Bf-109G, which was known to have a better high-altitude performance. A week later, a reconnaissance Mosquito on a high-speed run over Bremen was jumped by a single German fighter. The pilot, a veteran of dozens of such missions, radioed back a terse, shocked message. Bandit overtook me at will. Estimate speed in excess of 440 mph, not a 109 or 190. Repeat, not a known type. He only escaped by diving to treetop level. The report was dismissed. The Mosquito was one of the fastest aircraft in the world. The idea that a German piston-engine fighter could catch it from behind was considered aerodynamically impossible. The analysts concluded he must have encountered a revolutionary new jet, the Me-262, and misjudged its speed. The fact that the Me-262 was not yet in squadron service was conveniently overlooked. Then came the rockets. On February 10, during a raid on Brunswick, several bomber crews reported seeing flaming telephone poles arcing towards their formations from beyond the range of their 50-caliber guns. One B-24 Liberator was seen to disintegrate without any German fighter seeming to be nearby. The crew of the Memphis Belle II reported a massive explosion that shook their aircraft violently, as if they had flown through an artillery shell burst. It wasn't a missile that hit us, the bombardier later wrote in his diary. It was the air itself that exploded. The intelligence debriefers labeled these reports flak bursts misidentified or likely engine explosions. The concept of a Luftwaffe fighter standing off at 1,000 yards and launching a weapon that could destroy a bomber with its shockwave was considered fanciful. The most chilling warnings came from the Ultra Decrypts themselves, the supposedly unassailable source of Allied intelligence. Intercepted German communications began to mention new units with designations like Sturmstaffel I and Special Ram Commando training. There were references to Panzerjäger, tank hunters in the air, and increased production figures that, if taken at face value, would have invalidated every Allied assessment. But the analysts at Bletchley Park and in the Air Ministry, conditioned by years of German exaggeration and their own preconceptions, interpreted these as propaganda, morale-boosting lies, or code names for existing units. The intelligence was there, glowing in the raw intercepts, but the will to believe it was not. A low-level analyst in the Air Ministry, a young woman named Elena Reed who had a knack for cross-referencing disparate data, compiled a brief report suggesting a correlation between the strange combat reports, the ultra mentions of new units, and the odd gaps in reconnaissance photos showing cleared forest areas with no apparent purpose. Her superior, a wing commander steeped in the official narrative, scribbled highly speculative, no corroborating evidence across the cover and buried it in a filing cabinet. The system was designed to filter out noise, but it was now filtering out the signal. The tension was a palpable thing in the ready rooms of the 8th Air Force bases scattered across East Anglia. The veterans, the men with 20 or more missions under their belts, felt it in their bones. The war was changing. The attacks were becoming more aggressive, more coordinated, and somehow different. There was a new ferocity in the Luftwaffe's attacks, a willingness to close to distances that seemed suicidal. The easy confidence of late 1943 was beginning to evaporate, replaced by a wary, unspoken dread. The Germans were supposed to be on their last legs, so why did it feel like they were getting stronger? The stage was set. The actors were in position. The Allies, convinced of their impending victory, were blind to the carefully laid trap. The Germans, having marshaled their last reserves of strength and ingenuity, were poised to spring it. All that was needed was the right moment, the right target, and the order to commit. That moment was fast approaching, and its name was Big Week. The orders came down on the evening of February 19, 1944. The following day, February 20th, would be the launch of Argument, the operational name for what would become known as Big Week. The target list was the heart of the German aircraft industry: Leipzig, Bernburg, Brunswick, Gotha, Regensburg, and Schweinfurt. Over 1,000 bombers from the 8th Air Force would strike, supported by nearly as many from the RAF Bomber Command by night. It was to be the knockout blow. At bases across England, the pre-mission rituals played out with a grim solemnity. Crews were briefed, the long red yarn on the map stretching deep into Germany. The intelligence officers gave their standard spiel. Expect moderate to heavy fighter opposition, primarily FW-190s and Bf-109s. Their tactics will be standard. Your escorts will be with you as far as their range allows. There was no mention of impossible speeds, of aerial rockets, of armored assault groups. The men were told they were going to finish a wounded enemy. As the first of over 1,000 B-17s and B-24s began their takeoff rolls in the pre-dawn darkness of February 20th, a parallel drama was unfolding in German headquarters. The Naxos detectors had already picked up the H-2S emissions from the forming bomber streams. The warning went out across the defense network: Grossangriff, a major attack. In underground command centers, Luftwaffe controllers began moving counters representing hundreds of fighters to forward bases. The Sturmstaffel pilots, their FW-190s heavy with armor and 13 cannon, checked their equipment with a grim finality. Today, they would test their new tactics against the American Wehrmachts, the four-engine bombers. The first combat of the day occurred near the German border. The P-47 Thunderbolt groups, with their new auxiliary fuel tanks, provided cover. They engaged the first waves of German fighters, mostly standard Bf-109s and FW-190s. The fighting was fierce but familiar. The American pilots, flying their rugged jugs, felt they had the measure of their opponents. They claimed dozens of kills. The mission seemed to be going according to plan. But as the bombers pressed deeper into Germany, beyond the range of the P-47s, the character of the air war changed. The first indication came to the crew of the B-17, Flying Fortress itself. The top turret gunner of the 909 spotted contrails high above, contrails that were climbing at an angle that seemed to defy physics. "Bogies, 12 o'clock high," he yelled over the intercom. "They're climbing like homesick angels." These were the first of the FW-190 D9s, using their superior high-altitude performance to get above the bomber stream, positioning themselves for the lethal dive. Then the rockets came. From the ball turret of the Memphis Belle II, the gunner saw a flight of Bf-110 heavy fighters approaching from the front, but instead of closing, they wobbled their wings and from under them launched what looked like smoke rings with fire in the middle. The WFR, GR, 21 rockets, ungainly and slow, lumbered towards the lead combat box of the 1st Bomb Division. They weren't aimed at individual aircraft. They flew into the center of the formation and detonated with colossal, non-explosive blast charges. The concussion was like a giant's fist. Two B-17s were instantly blown out of formation, their wings folding back as if made of paper. A third, the Yankee Raider, spun out of control, its tail section shattered by the sheer force of the blast. The carefully disciplined box, the source of the bomber's defensive strength, was torn open. Chaos erupted on the command radio frequencies. What the hell was that? They've got a new weapon. Formation breaking up. The German fighters, seeing the disarray, pounced. But these were not the cautious attacks of before. Groups of FW-190s, flying in tight, stacked formations of four, began boring in from the front. They didn't weave. They didn't jink. They flew straight and level directly into the face of the bomber stream. This was the Sturmstaffel. The lead bomber in the element, the Duchess, took the full force of the first pass. Four FW-190s, their engines screaming, opened fire at 500 yards. The 30 Mk-108 cannon shells, designed to destroy heavy tanks, tore into the cockpit and nose section. The effect was apocalyptic. The plexiglass nose evaporated. The pilots were killed instantly. The bomber staggered, then fell away, a funeral pyre of gasoline and oxygen. The German fighters flew so close that the American gunners could see the black and white checkerboard markings on their cowlings, and the grim, determined faces of the pilots behind their armored glass. They didn't break away until the last possible second, their aircraft riddled with 50 caliber holes but still flying, protected by their heavy armor plate. The bomber crews were stunned. This was not fighting. This was a slaughter. The German pilots were ignoring their own safety, trading damage for kills in a brutal calculus of attrition. The comforting rattle of a dozen 50 caliber machine guns from a single bomber, a sound that had meant security, now seemed pitifully inadequate against this new form of attack. High above the melee, the commander of the 4th Fighter Group, Colonel Donald Blakesley, leading his P-51 Mustangs to the rescue, listened to the panicked radio traffic with growing alarm. The voices were not just those of men in danger. They were voices of men who were confused, disoriented, facing something they did not understand. He pushed his throttle to the firewall, the Merlin engine of his Mustang screaming in protest. They had to get there fast. As his group crossed the Rhine, the scale of the battle became visible. The sky was a scribble of contrails, flak bursts, and the black smoke of dying aircraft. But it was the number of German fighters that made his blood run cold. There weren't dozens. There were hundreds. They swarmed around the bomber streams like angry hornets, attacking from every conceivable angle. And then he saw them. The new FW-190s with the long noses, dancing high above the fray, picking their moments to dive with terrifying speed. He led his group into the fight, his Mustangs tearing into the German formations. The P-51 was a superb fighter, perhaps the best of the war, and his pilots were veterans. They began to score kills, sending FW-190s and BF-109s spinning down in flames. For a moment it seemed the tide might turn, but the Germans did not break off. They reinforced. More and more fighters rose to meet them. It was as if they were fighting a hydra. For every one they shot down, two more appeared. The fuel gauges on the P-51s began to drop alarmingly. They couldn't stay much longer. Down below, in the shattered bomber formations, the situation was becoming desperate. The lead plane of the entire 3rd Air Division, carrying the air commander, was targeted by a full swarm from Sturmstaffel 1. The German fighters took the fire from the bomber's guns, their wings and fuselages sparking with hits, but they kept coming. At 200 yards they opened fire. The command B-24 shuddered under the impact of multiple 30 shells. 2 engines were blown away. The fuselage erupted in flame. The radio transmission from the dying bomber was short and static-filled, but the last words were clear, a voice tight with shock and disbelief. "They're everywhere. They're not breaking off. My God, they're..." The transmission cut out. On the ground, in the underground command bunker of the German air defense, Reichsmarschall Hermann Göring was receiving reports. He turned to his chief of staff, a rare, genuine smile on his face. "They are feeling it now," he said. "They are learning the price of coming into our sky." But in the air, the price was being paid in blood and aluminum. The American escorts, low on fuel and ammunition, were being forced to disengage. The bombers were left alone, deep in German airspace, with dozens of miles still to go to their targets and a sky still full of enemies. The new German fighters, the ones with the impossible speed, now had free rein. Colonel Blakesley, his fuel warning light glowing a steady, ominous red, made one last pass over the beleaguered bombers. He saw a formation of the long-nosed FW-190s positioning for another mass attack on the lead combat box. He keyed his microphone, his voice cutting through the static and chaos, a final, grim warning to the men below. "All bomber units, this is all bomber units, this is Mustang Leader. We are Bingo Fuel. Repeat, Bingo Fuel. Disengaging. You are on your own. Good luck." The words were a death sentence, delivered in the flat, professional tone of a man who had just run out of options. Colonel Blakesley's P-51 banked away, followed by the rest of his group, their silver wings catching the cold February sun as they turned for home. The protective screen was gone. Below them, the bomber stream, already mauled and bleeding, was now utterly naked. A collective shudder seemed to pass through the B-17s and B-24s. The intercoms fell silent, the usual dark humor extinguished by the stark reality. They were alone over the heart of the Reich, with 100 miles still to run to the target at Leipzig, and the sky was still thick with an enemy that had just revealed a new, terrifying face. The initial shock of the rockets and the head-on assaults had given way to a cold, grinding dread. This was not the battle they had been briefed on. This was something from a nightmare. High above, the FW-190D9s, the long noses, saw the escorts leave. It was the signal they had been waiting for. Like hawks that had been patiently circling, they tipped over into near-vertical dives. Their Jumo engines, superchargers screaming, propelled them downward at speeds approaching 500 miles per hour. To the bomber gunners tracking them, they weren't planes. They were silver streaks, impossibly fast, growing from specks to killers in the space of a single, panicked breath. The lead Dora, flown by Lieutenant Erich Hartmann of Jagdgeschwader 52, though he was far from his usual Eastern Front haunts for this critical defense, singled out a B-17 lagging on the edge of the formation. His dive was a pure, kinetic calculation. He didn't fire until he was well inside effective range. The 20 cannon in the wing roots and the twin 13 machine guns above the engine hammering in a brief, devastating burst. The shells walked up the fuselage of the Fortress. The Bad Penny, shredding the radio room, igniting the oxygen system, and finally detonating in the bomb bay. The bomber didn't so much explode as it came apart, its constituent pieces, wings, tail, fuselage, flying in separate directions in a blooming orange flower. Hartmann pulled out of his dive so hard the blood drained from his vision, his aircraft a blur as it shot past the formation and back up into the sun, untouched. This was the new pattern. The high-speed passes from above and behind, exploiting the blind spot of the top turret and the ball turret, were devastatingly effective. The American box formation, designed for mutual protection, was now a death trap. The disciplined crossfire was breaking down as crews, terrified of the unseen rockets and the unstoppable Doras, began to focus on their own immediate survival. The carefully maintained spacing between aircraft tightened and then loosened erratically as pilots took evasive action, further weakening the collective defense. Then the Sturmstaffel returned. Having rearmed and refueled at forward bases, the armored FW-190s came back with a vengeance. They did not bother with the fringes. They aimed for the heart, the lead combat box of the 1st Bomb Division, where the group navigators and bombardiers flew, the brains of the mission. The commander of the 91st Bomb Group, Lieutenant Colonel John Jack K. Roberts, flying in the lead aircraft, the Flying Fortress, saw them coming. A solid phalanx of perhaps 16 fighters, flying in 4 tight lines of 4, was boring in from 11 o'clock high. They were different. They looked heavier, their cowlings painted with fearsome shark's teeth and checkerboard patterns. They did not weave or jink. They came on like a wall of steel. "All gunners, concentrate fire on the front quarter," Roberts barked into the command frequency. "They're coming head-on. Don't let them through." A storm of 50 caliber fire erupted from the formation, a blizzard of tracers reaching out to meet the German charge. It was a terrifying spectacle of raw firepower. Tracers from a dozen bombers converged on the leading German aircraft. They saw hits sparking on wings and fuselages, saw pieces fly off, saw one FW-190 shudder, erupt in flame and cartwheel away. But the rest held their course. They were flying through hell and they were not turning back. The distance closed with terrifying speed. 1,000 yards, 500. The German fighters seemed to grow larger with every heartbeat. At 300 yards, the world dissolved into noise and violence. The Sturmstaffel pilots opened fire with their 30 cannon. The sound was not the familiar pop-pop-pop of lighter cannons. It was a deep, percussive thump-thump-thump that could be felt through the airframe of the bombers. The B-17 Liberty Bell, flying on the right wing of the leader, took a full burst from a Sturm aircraft. The 30 shells, designed to punch through a tank's armor, tore through the aluminum skin of the bomber as if it were paper. One shell detonated in the cockpit, killing the pilot and co-pilot instantly. Another ripped the right wing completely off at the root. The great fortress rolled onto its back and began a flat, spinning fall to earth. There were no parachutes. Another bomber, the Vulgar Virgin, had its entire tail section obliterated by a single, well-aimed shot. The horizontal stabilizer and elevators vanished in a cloud of shredded metal and fabric. The crippled aircraft stood on its nose and plunged vertically downward. The lead Sturm pilot, Oberleutnant Wilhelm Willy Moritz of Sturmstaffel 1, had his sights fixed on Colonel Roberts' plane. Tracers from the top turret and chin turret streamed past his canopy, one round shattering his side window, another ricocheting off his armored glass windscreen with a loud crack. He ignored it. His vision was tunneled on the cockpit of the B-17. He could see the faint outlines of the pilots inside. At 150 yards, he pressed the trigger. His aircraft shuddered as the Mk-108 spat their deadly projectiles. The shells walked across the nose of the Flying Fortress, shattering the plexiglass, and then tore into the cockpit. The co-pilot was vaporized. Colonel Roberts took a shell in the chest. The controls went slack. Moritz held his course until the massive bulk of the B-17 filled his entire world. At the last possible second, he hauled back on the stick, his aircraft grazing the top of the dying bomber as he shot over it. He felt the turbulence, a violent buffet, and then he was through, the formation now behind him. He glanced back. The lead bomber was falling out of formation, smoke pouring from its shattered nose. The command structure of the 91st Bomb Group had been decapitated. The psychological impact of the Sturm attack was even more devastating than the physical damage. The unshakable belief in the B-17's ability to absorb punishment and fight its way through was shattered. These German pilots were not just trying to shoot them down. They were trying to annihilate them, to ram them out of the sky if necessary. The myth of the fortress's invincibility died over Leipzig that day. Amidst the chaos, individual acts of heroism and desperation flickered like candles in a storm. The B-17, Memphis Belle II, its ball turret gunner dead from a 20 shell, and its radio room a shambles from a near-miss rocket blast, found itself as the temporary leader of a scattered element. Its young pilot, Captain James Jimmy Stewart, a 23-year-old from Indiana who shared a name with a famous actor but not his luck, took command. "Form on me," he yelled over the VHF radio, his voice cracking with strain. All ships from the 91st form on me. Tighten it up. Gunners, watch for the high-speed boys above. He was trying to reknit the fabric of the formation, to recreate the defensive box that was their only hope. A few bombers struggled to comply, but it was like trying to herd terrified sheep in a thunderstorm. A flight of BF-109s, seeing the disarray, swooped in for a classic rear attack. The tail gunner of the Memphis Belle II, Sergeant Frank "Doc" Brennan, a former medical student from Boston, waited. He let the lead 109 get close, its wingspan filling his gun sight. He squeezed the triggers. The twin 50 cals roared, the tracers converging on the German fighter's engine. It coughed black smoke and peeled away, but another took its place. Brennan swiveled his guns, his movements calm and precise despite the terror gnawing at his gut. He was in his element, a small island of competence in an ocean of madness. Meanwhile, the navigator of the Belle, Lieutenant Henry Hank Forsyth, was trying to calculate a new course. The lead navigator was gone, his aircraft spiraling down somewhere behind them. The formation was off track, pushed south by the evasive action and the relentless attacks. Flak began to blossom around them, black, oily smudges that rattled the aircraft like a tin can in a hailstorm. The Germans were guiding the flak using their Naxos detectors, homing in on the H-2S radar emissions. The protection of the clouds was a lie. They were exposed, naked, and perfectly targetable. "We're 5 miles south of the IP," Forsyth shouted to Stewart over the intercom. "We need to turn 10 degrees to the north to line up for the bomb run." "Roger," Stewart replied, his hands gripping the yoke so tightly his knuckles were white. "All aircraft, turning left 10 degrees on my mark." "Mark." He banked the heavy bomber, the other survivors in his ragged group following suit. The turn made them even more vulnerable, presenting their broadsides to the fighters still harrying them. It was then that the second wave of rockets hit. A swarm of BF-110s, lurking on the fringes of the battle, launched their Werfer Granate 21s from a mile away. The ungainly projectiles soared towards the reforming bomber element. One passed directly between the wing of the Memphis Belle II and its neighbor, the Flaming Fanny. The concussion was immense. The Belle was thrown upward as if hit by a giant wave, then slammed back down. The Flaming Fanny was not so lucky. The blast wave caught her directly underneath. The fuselage buckled, the wings folded upward, and the bomber disintegrated in a cloud of fuel and debris. 10 men were gone in the blink of an eye. On the ground, the drama was being tracked with feverish intensity. In the filter room at RAF Bentley Priory, the initial confusion had given way to a grim, horrified understanding. The reports flooding in from the bomber streams were fragmented, panicked, and spoke of losses on an unprecedented scale. The young WAAF plotter who had taken the first call from the Dover radar operator now moved counters representing entire bomb groups with a trembling hand. The counters were being removed from the board at an alarming rate. An intelligence officer with the rank of wing commander stood behind her, his face ashen as he read the latest decrypted ultra message. It was a German communique boasting of the successful interception and the annihilation of the first American combat box. For once, the Nazi propaganda seemed to be understating the case. He picked up a direct line to the headquarters of the 8th Air Force at High Wycombe. "Sir," he said, his voice hollow, "the jockey's reports are catastrophic. We're estimating 50-plus bombers down already, and they haven't even reached the primary target." There was a long silence on the other end of the line. Then the voice of General James "Jimmy" Doolittle, the commander of the 8th, came through tight and controlled. "Understood. Continue to monitor. We are assessing the situation." The line went dead. Doolittle hung up the phone and stared at the large situation map in his war room. The red yarn representing the bomber stream was pushing into Germany, but it was a thin, broken line now. The blue counters representing the escort fighters were all turning back, their fuel exhausted. The green counters representing the Luftwaffe seemed to be multiplying. Every assumption, Every piece of intelligence that had led to this moment was proving to be a grotesque error. The dying Luftwaffe was demonstrating a vitality that was both impossible and terrifying. Back over Leipzig, the surviving bombers finally began their bomb run. The initial point, or IP, was a bend in a river, but today it was a gateway to hell. The flak intensified, the sky a continuous roar of explosions and shrapnel. The bombers had to fly straight and level for what felt like an eternity, their bomb bay doors open, utterly helpless. Inside the Memphis Belle II, the bombardier, Lieutenant Alex Ace Kowalski, lay prone in the shattered nose, peering through the crosshairs of his Norden bomb sight. The city of Leipzig was spread out below, obscured by smoke and flak bursts. The electrical power of the plane was failing, the intercom cutting in and out. He was manually guiding the aircraft now, using the emergency crank to adjust the sight. Steady, steady, left, left, steady, he murmured, more to himself than to the pilot. The aircraft shuddered as a flak burst exploded off the right wing. A piece of shrapnel whizzed through the nose, tearing a hole in his flight jacket but missing his body. He didn't flinch. His entire world had shrunk to the crosshairs and the complex of buildings that was the Erla Messerschmitt factory, their target. "Bombs away," he finally yelled, slamming the release toggle. The Belle lurched upward, relieved of its 5-ton burden. The other surviving bombers in the group followed suit, a ragged cascade of 500-pound high-explosive bombs tumbling down toward the earth. They turned away from the target, the bomb-run turn that every crew prayed to see, and began the long, perilous journey home. But the Luftwaffe was not finished. The German fighters, low on ammunition and fuel themselves, made one last, desperate effort to punish the retreating Americans. The attacks became even more frenzied, more reckless. It was a free-for-all. Single German fighters would make solo passes through the formations, their pilots seemingly possessed. The Memphis Belle II was hit again. A FW-190, its pilot likely out of cannon shells, made a firing pass with only his machine guns, stitching a line of holes across the top of the fuselage and killing the radio operator. The ball turret, already inoperative, was sheared off by a collision with a diving Bf-109 that had just been shot down by a waste gunner. The German pilot did not bail out. He had chosen to take one of them with him. The return flight was a nightmare of attrition. Crippled bombers, their engines dead, their controls shot away, began to fall behind. These stragglers were mercilessly hunted down by roving packs of German fighters. The channels over the radio were filled with the heartbreaking calls of crews abandoning their aircraft, followed by static. The sky behind the formation was littered with the black smoke of their funeral pyres. Captain Jimmy Stewart fought to keep the Belle in the air. 2 engines were out, the hydraulics were failing, and the oxygen system was patchy. He flew low, skimming the treetops of the German countryside, using the terrain to mask them from further fighter attacks. The navigator, Forsyth, bled from a shrapnel wound in his leg, but continued to plot a course for the nearest friendly territory, refusing the morphine so he could stay conscious. They crossed the Dutch coast, the gray expanse of the North Sea a welcome, if terrifying, sight. Ditching in that frigid water was a death sentence for a wounded crew, but it was better than the certain death over land. One by one, the remaining engines began to sputter, fuel gauges dipping into the red. They had been holed in the fuel tanks, leaving a trail of high-octane gasoline behind them like a bleeding animal. "Prepare for ditching," Stewart called out, his voice weary but firm. The crew braced themselves, the gunners emerging from their stations, helping the wounded. The flight engineer handed out life vests and morphine syrettes. But then a miracle. A flight of P-51s, sent out on a long-range search and rescue sweep, appeared out of the haze. They circled the stricken fortress, a protective shield of 8 Mustangs. One of them pulled up close, the pilot giving a thumbs up. It was a small gesture, but in that moment it meant everything. They were not alone anymore. The Memphis Belle II would not have to ditch. The P-51s escorted them all the way to the English coast, to an emergency field in Manston, a runway specially designed for crippled aircraft. The landing was a controlled crash. The tires were shot out, so they landed on the rims, sending up a shower of sparks. The damaged landing gear collapsed, and the great bomber slewed to a stop in a cloud of dust and torn grass, its back broken but its crew alive. As the men stumbled out onto the tarmac, coughing, bleeding, supporting each other, they looked back at their aircraft. It was a wreck. The nose was a gaping hole, the tail was shredded, and the fuselage was a sieve. They had left with 10 men. 7 had returned. They had dropped their bombs, but at a cost they could never have imagined. The same scene, with variations of horror and loss, was playing out at airfields all across East Anglia that afternoon and evening. Bombers were landing on one engine, with dead and wounded aboard, some crashing on final approach, their crews too exhausted or too injured to manage a safe landing. The scale of the disaster was slowly becoming apparent. At the debriefing tents, the atmosphere was funereal. The intelligence officers, their clipboards ready, listened with stunned silence as the crews described the new German fighters, the rockets, the suicidal head-on attacks. The men were not hysterical. They were drained, hollowed out, their reports delivered in flat, emotionless tones that were more convincing than any shouted accusation. The intelligence was wrong, a grizzled gunner from the 100th Bomb Group said, staring blankly at the wall. You told us they were on their last legs. You lied to us. The officers had no response. The evidence was irrefutable. The first day of Big Week, February 20, 1944, would go down in history as one of the bloodiest days in the history of aerial warfare. The 8th Air Force had lost 97 bombers shot down that day, with dozens more written off due to damage. Over 1,000 airmen were killed, wounded, or taken prisoner. The Luftwaffe had lost fighters too, perhaps over 100, but they could replace them. The psychological blow to the Americans was incalculable. That evening in the office of General Karl Spaatz, the mood was grim. The reports were on his desk. The photographs from the strike showed the Leipzig factory damaged but not destroyed. The cost had been monstrous. Spaatz looked at his subordinates, his face a granite mask. They knew we were coming, he said quietly. They were ready for us. They have new equipment, new tactics, and more of everything than we were told to expect. He picked up the Joint Intelligence Committee report from January and dropped it into a trash can. This is worthless. We are fighting a new Air Force. I want a new assessment on my desk in 24 hours. I want to know what they have, how many they have, and how they're doing it. And I want a new plan. The comfortable narrative was indeed shattered. The shockwaves from that day would ripple through the highest levels of Allied command, forcing a brutal, painful reassessment of the entire combined bomber offensive. The road to victory, they now realized, would be far longer and far bloodier than anyone had dared to believe. The lowly radar operator's fear in the dawn had been a premonition. The foundations of Allied certainty had crumbled, and in its place was the cold, hard reality of an enemy that was far from defeated. The war in the air had just begun anew.